The first time I heard it, I told myself it was just the house settling. That's what old houses do, right? They creak, they groan, they whisper at night when the wind shifts through the wooden beams. That's what I told myself, standing alone in the empty hallway, my breath caught in my throat, staring at the wall where the sound had come from. A dull, rhythmic knock, like something inside was testing the space between us. I had only lived in the house for a week. It was supposed to be a fresh start. Instead, it was the beginning of something I wouldn't be able to escape. I should start at the beginning. My name is Mark Hanley. I'm 31 years old, recently divorced, and I moved into the house on Willow Lane because I needed a place to be alone. A place where I could pick up the pieces of my life after everything had fallen apart. The house was cheap, suspiciously cheap, but I didn't care. It was a Victorian built in the early 1900s with tall, narrow windows and a sagging front porch. The kind of house that had character, as the real estate agent put it, meaning it needed work. The walls had a slight musty smell. The floorboards creaked under every step, and the pipes groaned when I turned on the water. But it was mine. I spent the first few days unpacking, trying to make the place feel like home. The third night, I heard the first knock. It came from inside the wall. At first, I assumed it was a mouse. Maybe even rats. Old houses had those, right? But it didn't sound like scratching or scurrying. It was deliberate. A single, soft knock. Then another. I pressed my palm against the wall. The plaster felt cold. I stayed like that for a long moment, listening, but the sound never came again. Over the next few days, I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping into my gut. I worked on small renovations, fixing up the loose cabinets in the kitchen, replacing a few cracked tiles in the bathroom. I try not to notice the odd things, like how my tools never seemed to be where I left them, like how the kitchen faucet sometimes turned itself on in the middle of the night. And then, on the fifth night, the knocking returned. This time, it didn't stop. Knock, knock, knock. I sat up in bed, heart hammering. The sound was coming from the wall behind my headboard. I swallowed hard, trying to rationalize it. Pipes shifting, a tree branch tapping against the siding. I turned on the light. The knocking stopped instantly. The silence that followed was worse. I lay awake until sunrise. I finally decided to investigate on the seventh day. I was tired of feeling like I was being watched in my own home. I was exhausted from jumping at every shadow, every unexplained sound. So I went to the garage, grabbed a hammer, and found the section of the wall where the knocking had been the loudest. I hesitated. Then I started swinging. The first hit cracked the plaster. The second broke through, revealing something dark beneath. It looked like rotted wood at first, but as I peeled away more, my stomach clenched. It wasn't wood. It was bone. The moment I saw it, I knew something was wrong. The bone was dark, almost yellowed with age, smooth in some places but brittle in others. Dust clung to it, and as I stared, my stomach churned with a deep, instinctive revulsion. I forced myself to breathe. Maybe it wasn't what I thought. Maybe it was old animal bones, left behind by a previous owner. Maybe some past resident had hidden in the walls some weird superstition or cruel prank. But deep down, I already knew the truth. This was human, and it had been here a very, very long time. I pulled my phone out with shaking hands, snapped a few pictures, and then hesitated over what to do next. Call the police? That's what a normal person would do, right? But something stopped me. It wasn't just fear. It was curiosity. I wanted to see how deep this went. So I kept going. I widened the hole in the wall, pulling away more plaster, my hammer striking harder than before. Pieces crumbled to the floor, dust rising in thick clouds around me. And then I saw the skull. It stared at me, hollow and dark. The jaw was slightly open, as if in a silent scream, and what remained of the teeth were uneven, broken in places. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't a single set of bones. There were more. I could see them now, partially buried in the wooden framework of the house, tangled together like discarded dolls. I dropped the hammer. My skin prickled as the temperature in the room seemed to plummet. The air itself felt heavy. The silence was too thick, pressing against my ears. And then a whisper, soft, distant, but definitely there. You shouldn't have looked. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. My mind scrambled for explanations. The whisper could have been the wind, or my imagination, but the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. Something was wrong with this house. I forced myself to move, rushing out of the room, my hands still coated in plaster dust. I locked the door behind me as if that would somehow keep whatever was in there inside. For the rest of the night, I sat in the living room with the lights on, my mind racing. I couldn't stay here, but I also couldn't leave, not without knowing who they were and why they were buried in my walls. The next morning, I made a decision. I needed to know the house's history. I drove to the town records office, an old brick building with faded signs and dust-covered filing cabinets. The clerk, an older woman with tired eyes, barely looked up as I approached. "I'm looking for records on a house," I said. "Willow Lane. It's been there a long time." Her expression changed instantly. She sat up, her gaze sharpening in a way that sent a cold ripple down my spine. "You bought that house?" "Yeah." "Why?" She hesitated. Then, without another word, she turned and disappeared into the back room. Minutes passed. I could hear the rustling of paper, the occasional clatter of metal drawers. When she returned, she set a single, worn folder down in front of me. And then she said something that made my blood run cold. "You're not the first person to come asking." I opened the folder. Old newspaper clippings. Black and white photos of the house in its early days. A missing persons report. No, multiple reports. Names I didn't recognize. But as I flipped through, my breath caught on a single article, the headline so shocking it felt like a slap to the face. "Tragedy on Willow Lane. Family of 5 disappears without a trace." The date was 1948. The family had lived in my house. They had gone to bed one night and were simply never seen again. No signs of forced entry. No struggle. The only strange detail? Neighbors reported seeing strange figures moving behind the windows in the days after the disappearance. But when police entered the house, no one was there. I felt sick. I shut the folder and pushed it away like it was burning me. The woman behind the desk watched me, her expression unreadable. "You should leave," she said quietly. I wanted to. I wanted to walk out, drive away, and never look back. But I couldn't, because I knew deep down that the family was still there, and their bones were in my walls. I should have walked away. I should have driven straight to a motel, called the cops, and never set foot in that house again. But I didn't, because the moment I stepped outside the records office, my phone buzzed with a notification. One new voicemail. I hadn't heard it ring, hadn't felt it vibrate. With a sense of growing dread, I pressed play. At first, it was just static, a hollow, crackling sound that sent shivers through my spine. Then, beneath it, something else, something faint. A voice. A voice I didn't recognize. It was garbled, distorted, like it had been dragged through water. But I still heard it. You need to listen. And then a knock. Soft, distant, but unmistakable, coming from inside my own phone. I ended the call so fast my hands shook, I didn't go back to the house right away. Instead, I drove aimlessly, gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles ached. The town outside my window blurred past, old brick buildings, empty sidewalks, a gas station with flickering neon lights. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that if I looked in my rearview mirror, I'd see someone in the back seat. Or worse, something. Finally, I pulled into a diner on the edge of town. It was nearly empty, just a few old men nursing coffee, a waitress refilling sugar dispensers. The normalcy of it all was grounding. I ordered black coffee, barely tasting it as I tried to piece everything together. The knocking, the bones, the missing family, and now the phone call. Someone or something was trying to tell me something. But what? I don't remember how long I sat there, lost in thought. But at some point, I noticed someone watching me. A man, late 60s, maybe 70s, wiry, weathered face. He sat in a booth near the door, his gaze locked on me. The moment I met his eyes, he nodded. A slow, deliberate motion. Then he stood and walked toward my table. You just bought that house, didn't you? His voice was rough, like someone who had smoked all his life. I hesitated. Yeah. How did you? Because I used to live there. My stomach dropped. I gestured for him to sit, my pulse hammering. You live there? When? Long time ago. He exhaled, shaking his head. Didn't stay long. My parents moved us out when I was 10. My dad said it wasn't safe. What do you mean? The old man leaned forward. Did you find them? A chill swept through me. I didn't need to ask what he meant. I already knew. The bones, I whispered. He nodded, eyes dark. They were there when my dad first opened the walls. We didn't call the cops. He just put the plaster back up and told us to never go near that part of the house again. Why? My voice felt too loud, too shaky. The man hesitated, glancing toward the door as if deciding whether to leave. Then, in a low voice, he said, because if you look too long, they start looking back. I barely remember leaving the diner. I barely remember driving home. But suddenly I was standing in front of my house again, staring up at its warped wooden frame, its dark windows like watching eyes. The air felt wrong. Too still. Too heavy. I should have left. Instead, I stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Rot. Like something damp and decayed, seeping from the walls. The second thing, the hole I had made in the wall, it was gone. The plaster was perfectly smooth, as if I had never touched it. I reached out with trembling fingers, pressing against the surface. Cold. The room tilted around me. I stumbled back, breath quickening. No, this wasn't right. I had broken that wall open. I had seen the bones with my own eyes. Hadn't I? I turned, ready to run, and then I heard it. A soft, familiar sound. Knock, 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 from inside the wall. Then a whisper, barely more than a breath. Please, help us. I spun around, my back pressing against the opposite wall. The room felt smaller, tighter, like the walls were closing in. The knocking grew louder. Desperate, I ran. I don't know how I made it to my bedroom, but suddenly I was inside, slamming the door shut, heart pounding. For hours, I sat there back against the door listening. The knocking, the whispering. And then, just before dawn, a sound that made my blood turn to ice. Not knocking, not whispering, something moving inside the walls. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Not with them still moving inside the walls. Not with the whispers curling through the darkness like dead leaves in the wind. Please, help us. The words scratched against my brain, hollow and pleading. I sat in the corner of my bedroom, knees to my chest, staring at the door. Every so often, I'd hear a faint tap, like fingernails against wood. I told myself it was my imagination, but I knew better. Something was in the walls, and now it knew that I knew. Morning came, gray and sickly. The light barely reached through the drawn curtains, casting the room in a dim, yellowed haze. I forced myself to move. My body ached from hours of stillness. My mind felt frayed, like an old rope unraveling one thread at a time. As I stepped into the hallway, a sharp smell filled my nose, rot and old plaster. And something else, something worse. I turned toward the living room and stopped cold. The hole in the wall, the one that had vanished the night before, was back. But it wasn't the same. The edges were jagged, uneven, like something had clawed its way out. I swallowed hard. The house was changing. Or maybe it was remembering. I needed answers. I needed to know what had happened here. I grabbed my phone and scrolled back to the number for the old man from the diner, Henry Wade. My fingers shook as I hit call. 1 ring. 2. 3. Then, I was waiting for you to call. His voice was flat, hollow. I swallowed. You said you lived here before. You knew about the bones. You knew about the knocking. What the hell happened in this house? Silence. Then they never left. My blood turned to ice. What? Henry sighed, and when he spoke again, his voice was strained. They were buried in the walls, son, but they were never dead. A cold sweat broke out across my skin. I turned back to the gaping hole in the wall, to the darkness waiting inside it. Never dead. The bones have been watching me, listening, waiting. Who are they? I whispered. A long pause. Then Henry said something that made my breath stop. Did you check the basement? I hadn't. I hadn't gone near it since I moved in. But now, standing in my ruined living room, I felt the weight of it pressing down through the floorboards. The air was wrong. Heavy. Electric. Like the house itself was breathing. I stepped toward the basement door. My pulse hammered. The knob was ice cold under my fingers. I turned it. The door swung open with a low, groaning creak. Darkness yawned before me, thick and smothering. The air reeked of mildew and something rotting. A sound rose from below, faint, wet, like something moving through water. I hesitated on the top step. My entire body screamed not to go down there. But I had no choice, because something was waiting for me in the dark, and it wanted me to remember. I should have left. I should have slammed the basement door shut, walked out of that cursed house, and never looked back. But I didn't, because something was waiting for me down there, and it wanted to be remembered. The basement stairs groaned beneath my weight. The deeper I went, the colder it became. The air felt thick, pressing against my skin like damp hands. My phone flashlight cast weak, flickering light along the stone walls. And then I saw it, the door. It was old, older than the house itself. A heavy slab of dark wood, warped with age, embedded in the stone foundation. But what made my stomach twist, what made me grip the railing until my knuckles turned white, were the scratches. Dozens of them. Deep, jagged grooves clawed into the wood as if someone had been trapped inside. I reached out with shaking fingers, pressed my palm against the surface. It was warm, like something was breathing on the other side. A whisper curled against my ear. "Let us out." I stumbled back. My phone slipped from my fingers, tumbling to the floor. The light spun wildly, casting shadows that moved. Then knock, 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 from inside the door. My breath caught in my throat, and then I heard it. A click. The door was unlocking itself. I ran. I ran up the stairs, my pulse slamming in my ears. I could hear something behind me, something wet and crawling. As I reached the top, the basement door slammed shut on its own. The house shuddered. The walls groaned. And then the whispers began. Soft at first, like wind slipping through cracks. Then louder. More voices. Crying. Pleading. "He put us here. We can't leave. He buried us." The words tangled together, frantic and desperate. I gripped the doorknob. Twisted. Pulled. Locked. I was trapped. The walls began to move. At first, I thought it was my vision blurring, my mind breaking under the pressure. But no, the walls were shifting. The wallpaper peeled away in strips, revealing something beneath. Something horrible. Faces. Twisted, sunken faces pressed beneath the plaster, their mouths frozen in silent screams. Their eyes, dark, hollow-moved. They watched me. A jagged whisper rose from the walls. "He did this to us." My stomach twisted. I knew who he was. Henry Wade. I yanked out my phone, my fingers trembling as I called him. He picked up instantly. "You saw them, didn't you?" His voice was heavy, almost regretful. "You knew this whole time?" I hissed. A long silence. Then, "I tried to warn you." My hand shook. "What the hell happened in this house, Henry?" Another silence. Then he said something that made my blood freeze. "My father built that basement door, son, and he was the one who locked them inside." My vision blurred. It all made sense now. The bones in the walls, the voices, the whispers. Henry's father had sealed them in. Who were they? I whispered. Henry exhaled, the sound ragged. They were our housekeepers, servants. My father. He wasn't a good man. He didn't want to pay them. Said they knew too much. So his voice broke. He made sure they never left. A chill ran through me. "Henry," I whispered, gripping the phone. "The door in the basement. It's open." Silence. Then, "You need to run." But it was too late. A deep, creaking groan rolled through the house. The walls buckled. The whispers became screams. The faces pushed through the plaster, hands clawing, reaching. I bolted. The floor tilted beneath me, the wood splitting open like rotting flesh. The house was breaking apart. Or worse, it was coming alive. I made it to the front door, twisted the knob. Locked. Something was behind me. I felt the air shift. Cold, rotting breath whispered against my neck. I turned and saw them. Their bodies half formed from the walls, their mouths opening too wide, eyes black with hunger. They reached for me. I screamed. The next thing I remember, I was outside, lying in the dirt. The house stood silent behind me, its windows dark and empty. The basement door had closed, and I understood. They had let me go. I never went back. I put the house up for sale the next morning. No one would buy it. A week later, it burned to the ground. The fire marshal said it was spontaneous combustion, that the structure had been too old, too unstable. But I knew the truth. The house didn't burn on its own. It was them. They had finally escaped. And somewhere, in the ashes and rubble, the bones were gone. It's been months. I've moved 3 states away. Started fresh. But sometimes at night, I still hear it. A knock. Soft. Distant. Like something inside the walls. Waiting.